Welcome back to Nicki Woo Cozy Stories. I'm your host, Nicki. Tonight, we continue our cozy retelling of The Secret Garden, Episode 8, The Shadow and the Gift. For an entire week afterward, the rain fell again. It didn't fall in a sudden, angry storm, but in a gray, steady drizzle that seemed as if it would never end. The mist hung so thick over the moor that the world outside Mary's window simply vanished, leaving Misselthwaite Manor floating like a gray stone ship in a sea of white. But inside, the contrary girl and the young Rajah did not mind the rain at all. Every morning, as soon as she had finished her breakfast, Mary would slip down the long, winding corridors to the hidden door. She no longer felt like a ghost wandering through a tomb. She felt like a traveler visiting a secret kingdom. In Colin's room, the fire was always banked high, casting a warm, flickering orange light over the velvet rose-colored hangings and the heavy dark furniture. They spent those rainy hours in a way that would have utterly scandalized Mrs. Medlock or Dr. Craven. Instead of the boy lying in a dark, silent room, brooding over his humped back and his coming death, the room was filled with the rustle of turning pages and the low, excited murmurs of two children sharing a secret. Colin had ivory glass boxes filled with wonderful things, ancient medals, strange carved fans that smelled of sandalwood, and hundreds of beautiful picture books with gold leaf edges. They would sit together on the edge of his great sofa, their heads bent close, looking at drawings of tropical birds with feathers like jewels and great sprawling palaces in India. "It is as if we were in the garden ourselves," Colin whispered one afternoon, his thin hand resting on a page showing a forest of flowering trees. "A garden made of paper and ink, but yours is real, Mary, the one you found. Tell me about it again. Tell me about the wick things." And Mary would tell him. She described the gray-brown fountains of the climbing roses, the tiny green points of crocuses pushing through the earth, and the way the robin watched them as his bright, knowing eye. She told him about Dickon, who could charm the very soul out of a wild thing, and how the moor was waiting, just under the mist, to turn purple with heather. The nurse would sit in the next room, marveling at the silence. There were no tantrums, no screaming fits that shook the house, and no weeping. There was only the steady hum of Mary's voice and the occasional, rare sound of Colin's dry, rusty laugh. They were like two conspirators. Colin was the Rajah who had forgotten to be a tyrant, and Mary was a girl who had forgotten to be lonely. But even as they laughed over the picture books, Mary's eyes often would drift to the window. She was waiting for the gray to turn blue. She was waiting for the moment the sun would wake the garden, and she could see if the wick things had grown while she was away. Now, it was early, so early that the world still felt as though it were held in a hushed, silver dream when Mary Lennox first stirred. For the past week, her mornings had begun with the rhythmic, mournful drumming of rain against the thick, leaded glass of her window. She had grown used to waking to a room bathed in watery gray shadows, where the heavy oak furniture looked like huddled giants in the gloom. But this morning, something was different. Even before she opened her eyes, Mary felt a peculiar warmth pressing against her eyelids. It wasn't the artificial heat of the coal fire in the hearth, which had long since burned down to white ash. It was a living warmth. She slowly blinked her eyes open and let out a tiny gasp of wonder. The heavy, weeping mist that had swallowed Misselthwaite Manor for 7 long days had vanished as if by magic. In its place, a long, brilliant shaft of pure gold was piercing through the gap in her heavy velvet curtains. It danced across the faded patterns of her rug, illuminating a million tiny motes of dust that swirled in the air like microscopic stars. Mary threw back the heavy quilts, her heart giving a sudden, joyful thud against her ribs. She ran to the window on bare feet, feeling the coldness of the floorboards, and pulled the curtains wide. "Oh," she breathed, her forehead touching the cool glass. The moor was no longer a wall of suffocating white. It had been transformed. Under a sky of deep, translucent blue, a blue so clear it looked as if it had been scrubbed clean by the rain. The great wide stretch of the Yorkshire land was glowing. The heatherland, which had looked so black and sodden the day before, was now a sea of bronze and gold in the early light. The distant hills looked near enough to touch, and the air, even through the glass, Mary could tell the air had changed. She didn't wait for Martha, the sour little girl from India, who had once stood stiff and yellow-faced while a servant pulled on her stockings, was gone. This was Mary, a girl who knew that every minute spent indoors was a minute stolen from the wick world outside. She began to dress herself with quick, purposeful movements. She struggled with the many buttons of her undergarments, her fingers fumbling in her haste, but she didn't grow cross. She pulled on her thick wool stockings, tugging them up with the new strength in her arms that she hadn't possessed a month ago. She reached for her boots, the heavy, sturdy boots that Mr. Craven had provided, and laced them tightly, her face flushing pink with the exertion. When she finally pulled on her coat, she caught a glimpse of herself in the tall, tilted mirror. She saw a girl with bright eyes, hair that was starting to look thick and healthy, and cheeks the color of a wild rose. "It's come," she whispered to her reflection. "The spring has truly come." She slipped out of her room, closing the heavy door with a click that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the silent hallway. The manor was still deep in its morning slumber, and as she hurried down the long, winding corridors, she felt like a little gray shadow passing through a museum of the past. The portraits of the Cravens from centuries ago, stiff men in armor and ladies with pale, unsmiling faces, seemed to watch her with curious, painted eyes. Perhaps they were wondering where this small, determined person was going at such an hour. She reached the side door that led to the gardens. The iron key was large and cold, and it took both of her hands to turn it in the lock. Clack, turn. The sound was satisfyingly heavy. She pushed the door open and stepped over the threshold. The world outside was a symphony of sound. Every bird on the estate seemed to be shouting to its neighbor that the sun was back. The grass was so heavy that the dew looked as if it was a casket of diamonds that had been scattered around the lawn. Mary didn't walk. She felt as though her feet had wings. She ran across the glittering grass, her breath coming in quick, happy puffs of the white in the crisp air. She didn't mind the dampness soaking into the hem of her skirt. She passed the stone fountains of the silent sundial, moving deeper into the grounds until she reached the high, ivy-colored wall. She reached into the thick curtains of the ivy, her fingers finding the familiar iron handle. The door swung inward on its silent hinges, and Mary stepped into her secret world. The garden wasn't quiet. It was humming. The very earth seemed to be vibrating with the effort of things pushing upward. And there, standing perfectly still in the center of a patch of golden light, was Dickon. But he wasn't alone. Mary stood perfectly still by the door, her breath catching in her throat. She had seen Dickon before, but never like this. Never in the first crystalline light of a spring morning when the world felt as if it had just been created. He was standing near a crooked old apple tree, his back to her. He wasn't moving a muscle. He looked less like a boy and more like a strange, sturdy fungus or a moss-covered stump that had grown out of the ground overnight. His stubborn, rust-colored hair seemed to catch the sun, and his patched clothes were the exact color of the bark in the soil. But it wasn't just Dickon that held Mary frozen. It was the nursery around him. Resting near his booted feet was the little red fox, its bushy tail curled neatly around its paws, its golden eyes blinking sleepily in the sun. On a low-hanging branch just above his shoulder sat the soot-colored crow, its head cocked to one side as if it were listening to a conversation Mary couldn't hear. And scuttling along the rough bark of the tree were two squirrels, their tiny claws making a faint scratching sound that seemed loud in the morning silence. Dickon didn't turn around. He seemed to know she was there. It was as if he felt the change in the air when she stepped inside. "Bide a bit," he whispered. His voice was as soft as the wind through the heather. "Don't thee move. They're just getting settled into the sun. They've been damp and cold for a week, same as us." Mary obeyed. She became a statue. She watched as a squirrel leaped from the branch directly onto Dickon's shoulder. It sat there, shivering its whiskers, perfectly unafraid. Dickon reached up a hand that was brown and rough like a tree root, and moved with a slowness that was almost painful to watch. He didn't grab. He simply offered a finger. The squirrel sniffed it, gave a tiny chattering sound, and stayed. "He likes thee, Mary," Dickon said, finally turning his head just enough to show his wide, beaming smile and his bright round eyes. "He says thou smells like the wind and not like a house person this morning." Mary felt a glow of pride that was warmer than the sun on her back. To be told she didn't smell like a house person, like the stagnant air of closed rooms and medicinal powders, was the greatest compliment she had ever received. She stepped forward then, mimicking Dickon's slow, rhythmic gait. The fox didn't run. It simply watched her with a wise, ancient expression before yawning and stretching its lean legs. They come to him because he's wick, through and through, Mary thought. The garden around them was transformed. The gray-brown fountains of the climbing roses were now shining, tiny, reddish-purple tips. The earth at their feet was no longer a flat, brown crust. It was heaving. Everywhere Mary looked, the pointed green things had doubled in height during the rainy week. Gold and purple crocuses were beginning to split their sheaths, showing glimpses of the bright colored blooms hidden inside. "Look at 'em, Mary," Dickon whispered, kneeling down in the damp grass. "Them little chaps have been working hard under the dark while we were sat by the fire. They've been pushing, and now they've broke through to the light." He put his hand near a cluster of pale snowdrops that were nodding in the breeze. He didn't pick them. He just hovered his hand over them as if he were warming them. "It's a fair wonder," he said. "A fair wonder how much life is squeezed into a tiny bulb no bigger than a marble." The two moved together through the garden like two small, quiet ghosts of the spring. Everywhere they looked, the world was waking up in a way that felt almost miraculous. The gray-brown fountains of the climbing roses, which had looked like dead, brittle wood only weeks ago, were now showing tiny, sharp points of reddish purple. The very air seemed to vibrate with the effort of things pushing upward through the dark. Dickon stopped by a patch of earth near the base of a sun-warmed stone wall. Here, a cluster of dark, sharp leaves was pushing through the mulch of dead leaves and damp soil. He knelt down, his heavy, mud-caked boots sinking slightly into the soft, rain-soaked earth. He didn't say a word at first. He just looked at a tiny, pale green bud, no bigger than a ladybug, that was beginning to show a streak of brilliant, snowy white. Then, to Mary's quiet wonder, Dickon did something she had never seen a grown-up or even another child do. He leaned down, his wide, sun-browned face descending until it was just inches from the cold, damp ground. He closed his eyes, a peaceful look spreading across his features, and very gently pressed his lips to the side of the tiny, shivering flower bud. "What are you doing, Dickon?" Mary whispered. She felt as though she had stumbled upon a private prayer. Dickon sat back on his heels, his eyes shining like the dew on the grass. His face looked like a cheerful, carved wooden apple. "I'm giving 'em a bit of welcome, Mary," he said, his Yorkshire accent thick and warm. "Mother says flowers have ears and hearts same as us. They've been down there in the dark for months and months, lonesome-like, listening to the wind howl over the moor. I don't do no harm to let 'em know someone noticed 'em. It's let 'em know we're right glad they've come up to see us." Mary looked at the little green point. She felt a strange, sweet ache in her chest, a feeling of belonging that she had never once felt in the hot, dusty, lonely bungalows of India. The flowers were things that servants brought in vases. Here, they were friends. She knelt down beside him, the hem of her heavy coat soaking up the moisture of the earth. The soil smelled rich and ancient, the scent of the deep forest, hidden rivers, and the life waiting to happen. Following Dickon's lead, she leaned, her face down. She felt the cool, velvety dampness of the moss against her cheeks and the sharp, fresh scent of the waking bulb. Very softly, she too kissed the tiny green tip of a growing thing. It felt like a secret shared with the earth itself. It felt as if she were kissing the cheek of a sleeping baby, waking it gently so it wouldn't be frightened by the light. "Mother kisses us all every night," Dickon continued softly, his gaze drifting toward the distant, hazy purple line where the moor met the sky. "Even when there's 12 of us crowding the cottage and she's weary to the bone from scrubbing floors and baking bread for hungry mouths. She says a kiss is like a bit of sunshine you can carry into your dreams to keep the cold out. She says the same for growing things. 'Dickon,' she says, 'the flower folk know when they're loved. They grow twice as fast for a kind word and a bit of mothering.'" "I wish I had a mother like yours," Mary said. The words came out before she could stop them, small and a bit tremulous. She thought of her own mother, the beautiful, tall Lily, who had cared more for dinner parties than for the yellow-faced child in the nursery. Dickon reached out and patted a clump of crocuses as if they were ruffling a young brother's hair. "Thou's got the garden now, Mary," he replied, "and the garden's got thee. It's been waiting 10 years for someone to come and mother it. And as for my mother, well, she says she's got enough love in her for all the lonesome, hungry things in Yorkshire. She's already asking after thee, Mary. She's told me, 'Dickon, that little lass at the manor is like a plant that's been kept in a dark, bitter cellar. She needs to be brought out into the light and given a bit o' good soil to sink her roots into.'" They sat there for a long moment in the golden, rhythmic silence of the morning. Mary felt a strange sensation, as if she were growing herself, pushing up through the sour, hard crust of her old life into a world where the sun actually reached her. She looked at her hands. They were no longer thin and yellow, but flushed with pink of a healthy heart. "Is it wick yet, Dickon?" she asked, gesturing to the whole hidden world around them. "Aye," Dickon whispered, his voice full of awe. "It's so wick you can almost hear it breathing if you stay quiet enough." The sun had climbed higher now, burning off the last of the silver-gray dew and turning the secret garden into a cathedral of light and emerald green. Dickon rose from the damp earth, his movements as fluid and silent as a fox's, and beckoned Mary toward a thick, tangled corner of the garden where old ivy climbed highest over the stone walls. "Bide a bit," he whispered, his finger pressed against his lips. "And when I say bide, I mean thou must be as quiet as the stones and as still as the moss. We're going to see a bit of building that's more secret than any manor house." Mary followed him, placing her feet exactly where he placed his, stepping over the dry twigs so they wouldn't snap. They reached a spot where a giant gnarled pear tree leaned its heavy branches against the wall. Dickon pointed a brown finger toward a dense, protected crook in the ivy. There he was, the robin. He was not the plump, jaunty fellow who had hopped about looking for crumbs. He looked serious, important. In his bright yellow beak he held a long, thin piece of dried grass. His tiny, bead-like eyes darted back and forth, scanning the garden for any sign of a cat or a hawk. "He's building his castle," Dickon breathed, his voice so low it was almost a part of the rustle of the leaves. "He's found his ladybird, and now he's making a cradle. but he's a suspicious chap. If he thinks we're watching him, he might desert the place. We can't have that." They stood there for what felt like an eternity in the golden morning. Mary realized she had learned a new kind of patience, a deep, rhythmic stillness she had never known before. She watched the robin fly away with a quick, rhythmic beat of his wings, only to return minutes later with a tiny clump of soft gray moss. Then he was off again, returning with a strand of wool he had likely found snagged on a bramble out on the moor. "Look at him tucking it in," Mary thought. "He's as busy as a person." The stillness of the garden began to seep into her bones. Standing there beside Dickon, Mary felt as if the boundaries between herself and the world were fading away. She wasn't just a girl watching a bird. She felt like a part of the ivy, a part of the ancient wall, a part of the very air that the robin flew through. She noticed the way the sunlight filtered through the young leaves, casting a pattern of dancing shadows across Dickon's shoulder. She smelled the sharp, sweet scent of the bluebells that were just beginning to uncurl their heads nearby. "Mother says," Dickon whispered, barely moving his jaw, "that when thou art still enough, the wild things forget thou art a human. They start to think thou art just another tree or a bit of edge. That's when the real magic happens. That's when they let thee see how they live when no one's looking." The robin paused in his work. He landed on a spray of rosebriar, just 3 feet from Mary's face. He chirped, a sharp, inquisitive little sound, and tilted his head, looking directly into Mary's eyes. She didn't blink. She didn't breathe. She stayed as quiet as the grass, just as Dickon had taught her. The bird seemed satisfied. He gave his tall, jaunty flick, let out a tiny, triumphant ripple of song that sounded like a silver bell ringing in the silence. Then he dove back into the ivy to weave the wool into a hidden nest. "He likes thee, Mary." Dickon's grin was wider than ever. "He's given thee the word. He says thou art a wick thing yourself, and safe to be around. Most folk walk through the world like they're marching to a drum, scaring everything away. But thou's got the secret of staying still." Mary felt a surge of quiet happiness. In the big, empty rooms of Misselthwaite, she had always felt like an intruder, a contrary child who didn't belong. But here, under the watchful eye of the robin and the steady presence of Dickon, she felt she had finally found her place in the world. They watched for a long while, punctuated only by the occasional sigh of the wind and the distant, lonely cry of a curlew on the moor. Every time the robin returned with a new treasure, a bit of horsehair, a fragment of a leaf, Mary felt a thrill of pride, as if she were a silent partner in the building of that tiny, hidden home. She imagined the tiny blue eggs that would soon lie in that soft, mossy cradle, and the new life that would break through the shells just as the crocuses had broken through the earth. "It's a fair wonder," Dickon said at last, beginning to move away with that same slow, rhythmic gait. "A bird no bigger than a thumbprint, building a house to keep his young uns warm against the Yorkshire gales. It makes a body feel small and right glad to be alive at the same time." Mary followed him back toward the center of the garden, her heart full. But as the sun reached its midday peak, a sudden cold thought struck her. She had been gone for hours. She'd forgotten the young Rajah in his dark room. She had forgotten the House of Secrets entirely. The walk back across the lawn felt entirely different than the run toward the garden had hours before. Then Mary had been a girl chasing the sun, her heart light and her feet winged with excitement. Now she was a girl carrying the heavy, golden weight of 1,000 secrets. As she neared the gray, hulking stone of Misselthwaite Manor, the joyous, wild bird song of the garden seemed to fade behind her, muffled by the thick stone walls and the heavy, stifling silence of the house. The sun was still shining brightly on the moor, but the manor seemed to cast a long, cold shadow that reached out to pull Mary back into the world, of house people. The side door, which had been her gateway to freedom, now felt like the entrance to a dark and ancient prison. She turned the great iron key in the lock. The clack-clack of the mechanism echoed down the stone passage like a hollow bone snapping. Mary stepped over the threshold and immediately felt the change in the air. In the garden, the air had been wick. It smelled of crushed grass, warming earth, and the sweet, sharp scent of bluebells. Here, inside the manor, it smelt of ancient dust, heavy floor wax, and the faint, bitter medicinal scent of a sick room. Mary stood for a long moment in the dim light of the hallway, her eyes adjusting to the shadows. She realized that the house was not truly silent after all. From deep within the labyrinth of the corridors, coming from the direction of a long gallery, she heard a sound that made her skin prickle. It was a long, low wail of a sound, of pure, unadulterated misery. Then came a sharp, muffled crash, as if the tray of glass had flung against a wall into a fit of pique. "Ugh, he's started," Mary whispered to herself, her face hardening into a mask of contrary determination. She began to walk toward the sound. She didn't run this time. Her feet felt heavy in her sturdy boots, which were still caked with the dark, rich mud of the secret garden. As she passed through the gallery of portraits, the painted eyes of the craven ancestors seemed to look down on her with a sort of grim, frozen pity. They had seen this before. They had lived with the mousy cries and the rages of the manor for centuries. In the corridor outside of Colin's room, she found Martha. The poor girl looked as though she had aged 5 years in a single morning. Her apron was wrinkled and stained, her white cap was knocked crooked on her head, and her face was as pale as a sheet of parchment. She was wringing her hands together, so hard that her knuckles were white. "Oh, Miss Mary, thank the stars," they gasped, catching sight of her. She ran forward, her voice trembling. "Where in the world has that been? We've looked in the nursery, the library, and even the kitchens. He's been in a right state since 10 o'clock. He woke up and found they weren't there, and he's gone nearly out of his mind with the temper of it." "I was in the garden," Mary said calmly. She didn't feel guilty. In fact, she felt a spark of her old, sour Indian spirit returning. But this time, it was tempered with the strength she had found outdoors. Why should she stay in the dark, hot room just because a spoiled boy wanted her to sit by his bed? "He wouldn't listen to a word of reason," Martha sobbed, a stray tear escaping and rolling down her nose. "He screamed at the nurse until she locked herself in the cupboard, and he's thrown his beautiful new picture books all over the floor. He says he's going to die because they stayed away and let the damp get to him. Dr. Craven's been sent for, but he's out on the moor tending to a shepherd and can't be reached for hours. It's been a nightmare, it has. The whole house is shaken with it." Mary looked at the heavy oak door of Colin's suite. From behind it came another high-pitched shriek, followed by the sound of a silver spoon hitting the floor. It wasn't the sound of a boy in physical pain. Mary knew the difference. This was the sound of a tyrant, a young Rajah, who had been told no by the world for the first time. "He is a very selfish boy," Mary said. Her voice was low and steady, like the hum of a bee. "He's a dying boy, or thinks he is," Martha whispered, with her eyes wide with terror. "Go in to him, Miss Mary, please. He says he won't stop until they comes. He says thou art the only one that doesn't look at him like he's a ghost already." Mary didn't move for a long minute. She thought of the robin, and the way it looked at her, and the eye, trusting her because she was still. She thought of Dickon, leaning down to kiss the flowers, treating the earth with such tenderness. The peace of the garden was still inside her, a bright green flame, and the sound of Colin screaming felt like a cold, ugly wind trying to blow it out. "I will go in," Mary said finally, "but I won't be screamed at. If he screams at me, I shall scream back. He needs to know that he isn't the only person in the world who has a temper." Martha looked truly, mortally shocked, but she stepped aside and opened the door just at a crack. Mary reached out, gripped the cold brass handle, and pushed it wide. The room was in total suffocating darkness. The heavy velvet curtains had been pulled shut and pinned together, blocking out every single drop of the golden spring sun that was currently washing over the moor. The air was thick, hot, and smelled of sweat and old lavender water. And there, huddled in the center of the great dark four-poster bed, was Colin. He had buried his face in his silk pillows, his small frame shaking with the exhausted force of his own rage. Mary stood just inside the door, her heart thumping not with fear, but with a cold, hard indignation. The room was stiflingly hot, the air heavy with the scent of some medicinal powder that made her want to sneeze. It was a tomb, and in the middle of it, the young Rajah was making a spectacle of his own misery. He was lying face down, his thin silk-clad shoulders shaking. Every few seconds, a jagged, high-pitched sob would break from him, the kind of sob that comes from a person who has never been told no in 10 years. "Go away," Colin shrieked into his pillow, his voice muffled but sharp. "I told you all to go away. I'm going to die. I can feel the lump on my back growing. It's because everyone has left me alone in the dark." Mary didn't move. She didn't offer a soft word or a gentle hand. She looked at her own hands, still stained with the rich wick soil of the garden, and then she looked at the pale, shaking boy. "You are not going to die," Mary said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp and clear, as a Yorkshire frost. "And there is no lump on your back. I have seen your back, and it's as straight as mine. You are just a selfish, spoiled boy who wants everybody to be as miserable as you are." Colin froze. The sobbing stopped instantly, cut off as if by a knife. He rolled over slowly, his face white, and his large, hollow eyes red-rimmed from weeping. He looked truly, mortally shocked, as if a servant had reached out and slapped him across the face. "What did you say?" he gasped, his breath coming in short, ragged hitches. "I said you are selfish," Mary repeated, walking right up to the edge of the bed. "I have been out in the sun. I have seen the flowers waking up and the robin building a nest. The world is full of life and light, and you are staying in here, pulling the curtains shut and pretending to be a ghost. It's disgusting. It's more than disgusting. It's silly. You think you're so important that the world should stop because you have a headache." "I am ill," Colin screamed, sitting bolt upright. "I have a fever. My back is weak. I shall have a hump, and then I shall die. And then you'll be sorry that you were so wicked to me." "You haven't a hump," Mary shouted back, her own temper flaring to match his. "I've seen your back when the nurse changed your shirt. It's as straight as a poker. You just want to have a hump so that you can make everybody cry and do what you want. Well, I'm not crying. I'm angry. I was having a beautiful morning with Dickon and the animals, and I had to come back to this noise." The mention of Dickon seemed to hit Colin like a physical blow. His face twisted with a mix of jealousy and hurt. "Dickon? You are with him again? You like him better than me. Everybody likes him better. I shall have him sent away. I shall tell my father that he is a common cottage boy, and he isn't allowed on the grounds." "You can't send him away," Mary said, crossing her arms tightly. "And you can't make me stay here. If you scream at me, I will never come back into this room. I will go to the garden every day, and I will never tell you a single secret about it. You can stay here in the dark until you turn into a mushroom for all I care. You're just a heap of silken pillows, and I'd rather talk to the robin." Colin stared at her. No one in his entire life had ever spoken to him like this. He was used to people whispering and looking at him with pity. Mary looked at him with something that felt like a cold wind. It was bracing. It was the first real thing he had felt in years. He opened his mouth to scream again, but the look on Mary's eyes stopped him. She looked as though she truly didn't care if he screamed himself hoarse. I want to see the garden," he whispered, his voice cracking. But I can't. I'm too weak. And you've been with Dickon. You like him better." "Of course I like him better," Mary said, her chin tilting upward. "He isn't a heap of silk and pillows. He's a person. And if you want to be a person, you have to stop this. But I'm not staying here to watch you cry." Without waiting for him to reply, without a single glance back at the pale, trembling boy in the massive bed, Mary turned on her heel and walked out of the room, slamming the heavy door behind her. Mary slammed the heavy oak door behind her with a satisfying, solid thud that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. She stood there for a second, her chest heaving, her hands still balled into fist. The silence of the corridor felt strange and vacuum-like after the shrieking inside. A few yards away, the nurse was waiting. She was a big, burly woman with a red face and a cap that looked far too small for her head. Besides her stood Martha, looking like she was ready to bolt for the servants' stairs at the slightest sound. Mary expected the nurse to scold her, to tell her she had been cruel to a dying boy. Instead, to Mary's utter bewilderment, the nurse let out a sound that was remarkably like a snort of laughter. "Well," the nurse exclaimed, folding her arms thick across her chest, "I didn't think I'd live to see the day. You've given him what for, haven't you, miss? I could have heard you through the wood, and I've been standing here hoping you wouldn't stop until you told him every bit of the truth." "He's a very selfish boy," Mary said, still feeling the heat of her own temper. "He thinks he's the only person who has ever had a headache or a backache. And he hasn't got a hump. And I told him so." The nurse laughed then, a deep, wheezing sound that made her shoulders shake. "That's exactly what he needed. I've been ready to pack my bags and walk back to the village this week, I have. I'm a nurse, not a slave to a tantrum. If he'd had a sister, she'd have boxed his ears and told him to be quiet years ago. He's had nothing but people bowing and scraping and looking at him like he was made of sugar." Martha looked from the nurse to Mary, her eyes wide. But, nurse, won't he be ill from the shock of it? Dr. Graven says his heart." "His heart is as strong as a pony's," the nurse snapped, though her eyes were still twinkling at Mary. "It's his spirit that's gone sour from too much shade. You've done a better job in 10 minutes, Miss Mary, than all the tonics and powders in that room. He needed someone to tell him he wasn't a Rajah, but a boy with a bit of a temper." Mary felt a strange, warm sensation in her chest. It wasn't the contrary pride she usually felt. It was a feeling of being understood. She looked at the burly woman and realized that they were on the same side. They were both tired of the gloom of Misselthwaite. "I told him I wouldn't come back if he screamed," Mary said firmly. "And I meant it. I'd rather talk to the robin. The robin doesn't shriek when he doesn't get his way." "And right you are," the nurse said, giving a decisive nod. "Now, you go to your own rooms and get those boots off. You look like you've been digging for treasure. I'll go in there and see if he's ready to behave like a Christian. If he starts again, I shall tell him I'm sending for you to give him another talking to." Mary watched the nurse march toward the door, her heavy footsteps sounding confident on the rug. Martha lingered for a moment, letting out a long, shaky breath. "Tha's got a nerve, Miss Mary," Martha whispered, her eyes shining with a mix of fear and admiration. "I reckon the nurse is right. Thou'rt the only one in this house as isn't afeard of him. Go on now. Miss Medlock's been asking after thee, but I'll tell her thou'rt resting. Thou's earned a bit of quiet, thou hast." Mary nodded and turned away. And she walked down the long, dim gallery. She felt lighter than she had in weeks. She had fought a battle, and for the first time, the house people were looking at her, not as a nuisance, but as a hero. The walk back to her own wing felt like a victory march, though a very quiet and muddy one. Mary's boots made a dull thud on the heavy rugs of the long gallery, and for the first time, she didn't feel like a ghost haunting someone else's house. She felt solid. She felt wick. She pushed open the door to her own room, expecting the same cold, gray afternoon light she had left behind. But the fire had been stoked until it roared with a cheerful orange defiance, and there, sitting in the middle of the heavy oak table, was a package. It was wrapped in thick brown paper and tied with a sturdy, hairy string that smelled of hemp. Beside it sat a small, cream-colored envelope. Mary's heart gave a strange, fluttering skip. She hadn't received a package, and she had lived in the bungalow in India, and those had always been full of stiff lace collars she hated. She walked to the table, her fingers trembling slightly as she picked at the knots. When the paper fell away, she let out a small, soft "oh" of pure wonder. Inside were books. Beautiful, heavy books with gold lettering on the spines, and the pages felt like silk. One was a book about gardening, filled with colored plates of roses, lilies, and strange exotic vines that looked so real, Mary felt she could almost smell the damp earth they grew in. The other was a book of stories, with illustrations of knights and hidden castles. She opened the note. The handwriting was cramped and hurried, as if the person writing it had been in a great rush to get away. "I am told you enjoy the gardens," the note read. "I hope these will help you pass the time. I shall be away for some months. Do not be afraid to ask for what you need." It was signed, Archibald Craven. Mary sat down at the edge of her chair, the gardening book heavy in her lap. Mr. Craven, the hunchback, who wandered the moor in the middle of the night, had thought of her. He was miles away, wandering through Europe in a cloud of his own grief, but he had remembered the contrary girl. She looked at a picture of a climbing rose, its petals a deep, bruised crimson, and she looked toward the window. The moor was turning a deep, royal purple in the twilight, and the wind was beginning to moan around the eaves of the house. She thought of Colin, lying in his dark room, probably staring at the ceiling and wondering why the world hadn't ended when he screamed. She thought of the gift in her lap and the secret key hidden in her pocket. "I shall go back tomorrow," she whispered to the empty room. "I'll tell him about the books, and if he behaves like a person and not a Rajah, I might even tell him about the robin's nest, but only if he's wick enough to listen." She leaned back in her chair, a small secret smile touching her lips. The contrary girl was gone. In her place was a girl with a garden, a friend on the moor, and a package of books that smelled of new beginnings. The secret garden wasn't just behind the stone wall anymore. It was starting to grow right here, in the very heart of the Misselthwaite Manor. And now, the great stone house grows quiet once more. The long, dim corridors of Misselthwaite Manor settle into their evening stillness, and the last of the purple light fades softly beyond the wide, breathing moors. In her room, a young girl lies beneath her warm blankets, her heart finally at peace after the storms of the day. Her thoughts drift through the strange and powerful happenings as she has witnessed. The heavy clack of an iron key in a lock, the sharp, bracing truth spoken in a room once filled only with shadows, the unexpected sound of a burly nurse's laughter echoing in a hallway that used to know only whispers, and the weight of new books filled with pictures of roses waiting to be shared tomorrow. Beyond the thick stone walls, the secret garden rests in the cool night air. The branches are still. The wick life is pulsing silently beneath the dark earth, drinking in the dew. And somewhere, on the edge of the heather, a boy who understands the language of the wild sleeps with the promise of the morning sun. But those moments will come in their own time. When you return, we will step back through the hidden door and into the manor together. For now, the house is quiet, the moor is calm, and the night settles softly over everything. So let the stillness of the manor drift gently around you. Let the quiet promise of the garden carry your thoughts far away, and allow the story to rest here for the night. Sleep now. You are safe. You are loved. You have been listening to Nicki Woo Cozy Stories, created by Nicole T. Woodard. May your dreams be gentle and your sleep be deep.